In March 2026, a football club did something that almost never happens in English football. They asked to be relegated, not because they were broke, not because they were being punished in some way, and not because they'd run out of players. Hashtag United, one of the most recognisable non-league clubs in the country, voluntarily requested to step down from the Isthmian Premier Division of their own accord mid-season in writing. The question is why, and the answer says a great deal about where football and digital media are heading. I'm Dr. Andrew Jenkin, a lecturer in sports management at the University of Stirling, Scotland's University for Sporting Excellence. This week, we're using Hashtag's United decision to voluntarily step down from the Isthmian Premier Division as a lens to examine something much bigger, specifically what YouTube actually earns a football club, why the pyramid and digital model are increasingly pulling in opposite directions, and what the implications of that tension are for the next generation of football ownership. Hashtag United were founded in March 2016 by Spencer Carmichael Brown, better known online as Spencer Owen, a YouTuber who had built his audience making FIFA-related content. Spencer had been making YouTube videos since 2007, initially as a student at the University of Reading. His audience was built almost entirely around FIFA, the video game simulation of the sport he would eventually go on to run a real club in. And there's something quite ironic about that. A man whose following came from playing virtual football decided, when that following reached sufficient scale, to turn it into something physical. The original idea was more conventional: find a sponsor, buy an existing non-league club, document the experience. But Owen rejected that. Taking over an established club meant taking over its history and drawing critics for doing so. As he put it himself, we wondered if we could enter the pyramid as a new club, so we created a new club that we all played in. It was all about growing the audience first, and for want of a better word, the brand of the club. Then take that into non-league once we've got the support. Before entering any league, they spent 2 years playing exhibition matches in 7 countries, including a tour to America against the Comedians 11, former professional footballers, the Great British Deaf Team. They created the Wembley Cup, a charity tournament that brought together Spencer FC and the wider YouTube football community. Owen was honest about the limitations. We did 2 years of exhibition matches based purely on our YouTube following, not our footballing ability, because we were pretty average. In 2018, the opportunity arrived to enter the pyramid as a genuinely new club without displacing anyone else. That mattered to Owen ethically, but also practically. This was something he and his family had built from nothing. His brother played in the very first game. His father had been involved as a physio. There was no history to inherit or to be accused of appropriating. Just a YouTube audience, a set of values, and a question nobody properly had tested before. Could an online community become a football club? When the club entered the football pyramid in 2018, Spencer personally had around 1 million YouTube subscribers. The club itself had a following before it played even a single competitive match. The founding principle was, in football terms, completely back to front. Rather than building a club and then finding an audience, they built an audience first and then took it into the non-league system. Spencer Owen had described it himself as reverse engineering the traditional model. We had people watching us in every country in the world, but we didn't necessarily have people in a local area coming. That sentence, I would argue, contains the entire story of what has happened since. Their rise through the non-league system was rapid. They entered the Eastern County League in 2018, winning promotion at the first attempt, and were flying in the Essex Senior League when the pandemic cancelled the 2019-2020 season. Promoted again the following year and 2 seasons in the Isthmian League North Division, then promoted to the Isthmian Premier, which is step 3 of the English pyramid in 2023. 5 promotions in 7 seasons, while simultaneously growing a global online audience and attracting commercial partnerships that would be typically out of reach for a typical club of this size. Adidas are the kit manufacturer. Football Manager are the shirt sponsor. Cesar Azpilicueta, the former Chelsea and Spain captain, became a co-investor in 2018. As the book Who Owns Football observes, those deals were clearly not possible without their audience. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Hashtag United announcement, one comparison is worth pulling up on screen. At the time Hashtag United were competing in the Isthmian Premier Division, Luton Town were competing in the Premier League, facing the likes of Manchester City, Arsenal and Liverpool. While Luton had 103,000 YouTube subscribers, #United had 673,000 subscribers. A step-free non-league club had more than 6 times the YouTube following a top-flight team had. That tells you something important about where digital audiences and traditional football hierarchies are currently diverging. So let's get into the decision and the announcement made by the club itself. In March 2026, Spencer Owen published a 3-page statement on X. The headline read, "This is not a relegation, it's a revolution." In practical terms, what they were requesting was a voluntary demotion from Step 3, the Isthmian Premier Division, to Step 4 at the end of the 2025-26 season. In the normal course of events, that movement only happens as a consequence of finishing in the bottom positions of the division. Were asking for it to happen administratively by agreement, regardless of where they finished on the pitch. It is, or at least as far as I can establish, an almost unprecedented request in English non-league football. One thing to establish very clearly here is this was not a club in trouble. This was a deliberate and considered decision, and Owen's statement identifies several compounding reasons for taking it. The financial model at Step 3 is not sustainable given their income streams. Stepping down will generate budgetary savings that can be reinvested at a critical moment. But perhaps most honestly, he acknowledges that they need to build a genuine physical home, because without one, they cannot convert their online audience into a physical community that the pyramid requires. That last point is more significant than it might initially appear. Since entering the pyramid in 2018, have played competitive home fixtures at 6 different grounds, none of which their own. Their first competitive home was Coles Park, based in North London, despite being an Essex-based club, then Tilbury, then Bowers and Pitsea. They have been at Parkside in Averley since 2024, and from summer 2026 they will be ground sharing with Redbridge FC. With no owned ground or stable geographical anchor, it's very hard to build a matchday culture or loyal local following if you're ground sharing at a different venue every 2 years. That is not a criticism of the decisions made by the club, but just a circumstance of non-league ground sharing often being outside a club's control. But it's a structural obstacle to solving the very problem Owen identifies. There's also a third dimension to the decision that we will come back to later, a direct conflict between the content model and the rules of the pyramid itself. But let's look at the numbers first. The attendance gap. In 2024-25, #United averaged 213 people per home game, the lowest average attendance of any club in the entire Isthmian Premier Division. The division average was around 550. Dulwich Hamlet at the top of the attendance table averaged 2,226. Billericay Town, a club in the same county as #, averaged over 1,000. At Step 3, there is no broadcast deal, no meaningful prize money, and no central distribution from the Football Association. The financial model for clubs at this level depends primarily on matchday income, gates, bar revenue, programme sales. 213 people for a turnstile at £15 a ticket generates just over £3,000 per home game. Against weekly wage costs that typically run between £3,000 to £7,000 at this level, with some clubs spending considerably more, that matchday income covers very little. And #'s attendance problem is not the same as a traditional club underperforming its local catchment. Their fan base is global and primarily online. Those subscribers aren't necessarily going to drive to Averley on a Tuesday evening in January. What the pyramid costs. Player wage budgets at Step 3 typically run between £3,000 to £7,000 per week. Some clubs spend considerably more. Billericay were reportedly spending £16,000 a week during the 2024-25 season. At the lower end, that is still £150,000 a year in player costs alone before ground maintenance, travel, officials, or the security costs that some clubs at this level report running to over £100,000 annually. And then there is a layer specific to a club like #United, the thing that I think has been most underreported in the coverage of this story to date. The higher you climb in English football, the less you are actually allowed to post on YouTube. At Step 7, you can post your full match footage, your highlights, your behind-the-scenes content without restriction. At Step 3, FA media regulations begin to apply. Go further into the National League or the English Football League, and the broadcast rights belong to someone else entirely. You cannot post that footage. The deal has been signed and the content you depend on commercially is no longer yours. Let's think about what that means for a club like #United. The thing that makes # commercially viable is essentially being eroded by the very act of winning football matches. Succeeding on the pitch and you promote yourself out of your own business model. This structural contradiction was identified years before # made this decision. In the book Who Owns Football, Nick Miller notes as early as 2020 that if the club continued climbing, they would run into broadcast rights considerations that will make their highlights clips on YouTube trickier, to say the least. And that moment has arrived. What YouTube actually pays and the Liverpool comparison. It is worth being direct about what YouTube actually generates financially at # scale because the subscriber count can create a misleading impression. YouTube pays creators through RPM, revenue per 1,000 views. For UK sports content, that typically sits between £2 to £8. Looking at #'s actual recent video data, a standard match video generates somewhere between 57,000 and 105,000. A working average across their output sits around 75,000 views per video. 30 videos a year at that average, at £4 RPM, generates approximately £9,000 in annual ad revenue. That is 1 week's wages at the lower end of the step-free budget range. The real commercial value of the channel lies in what the audience enables, such as the Adidas deal and the Football Manager partnership. But even accounting for all of that, the model does not come close to funding a club at step 3. And there's an interesting aside here that is worth mentioning. Liverpool's YouTube channel passed 10,000 million subscribers in 2024. According to third-party analytics estimates, and it's worth being clear that these are estimates, not figures from Liverpool's accounts, their annual YouTube earnings may exceed the combined prize money paid to the winners of both the FA Cup and the Carabao Cup. The FA Cup winner receives approximately £2 million, whereas the Carabao Cup winner receives around £100,000. That a club's own content revenue might rival what teams receive for winning domestic cup competitions tells you something about where media value is shifting. For #, that level of scale is a long way off, but the principle that digital content can generate meaningful revenue independent of what happens on the pitch is exactly what their model is built on. The question is whether it can generate enough at their current scale to sustain a club in the pyramid. The evidence suggests not, at least not at step 3. Football's financial problem. Now, one broader point we should be touching upon here is that most football clubs lose money. Not occasionally, not in difficult years, structurally, persistently, and as a matter of routine. Kieran Maguire, probably the leading academic authority on football finance, is direct about this in his book, The Price of Football. His chapter on ownership models is titled, and I think this is worth putting on screen, Love, Vanity and Insanity. His assessment of the Championship is unambiguous. Almost every club in that division loses money. The data supports it. In the 2017-18 season, 18 out of the 24 Championship clubs made a net loss. A combined total of £292 million in a single season. Over the 5 years to the 17-18 season, cumulative losses across the Championship exceeded £1.1 billion. By 2019-2020, clubs in that division were spending £1.20p for every £1 they generated in revenue, a wages to turnover ratio of 120%. The pattern repeats at every level. Oldham Athletic, not a Premier League club, not a Championship club, not even a League One side, were losing £92,000 a week in League Two in 2020-2021. A club entirely dependent on owner subsidy just to function. The moment that subsidy stops, the consequences fall on players who are not paid, staff who lose jobs, and communities that lose something they have often had for over a century. Responsible ownership and the contrast. This brings us back to what Spencer Owen actually did when he made this decision, because I think that deserves more credit than it's received so far. The club informed their players before any public announcement, not after and not simultaneously, before. So those players had time to assess their options before the registration window closed. The playing budget was maintained and the women's team, which at # has been genuinely successful, winning the FA Women's National League Cup in 2024, was protected. Women's teams are almost always the first thing cut when a club needs to reduce costs quickly. Notts County folded theirs in 2017, Barnsley in June 2025 shut their women's operation after less than 2 years as a professional outfit, citing FA facility requirements they could not meet and financial losses they could not sustain. That pattern is pretty well established. Compare that level of responsibility with what we have seen elsewhere in the English game. Sheffield Wednesday, under the ownership of Demotion Chansiri, saw players go without wages on multiple occasions and the club receiving points deductions for financial irregularities. The direct personal cost of that falling on the players and staff whose livelihoods depend on the club functioning well. At Manchester United, the arrival of Sir Jim Ratcliffe brought with it significant redundancies across the club's non-playing staff, people who had in some cases worked there for decades. I'm not suggesting that those situations are directly comparable to what Hashtag are facing, but there is something worth acknowledging in the contrast. A 10-year non-league club built on the internet with no wealthy backer chose to prioritise the welfare of its people over the prestige of its league position. That is something worth noting. The KSI and Dagenham model. So if the pure digital-first model has structural limits in the pyramid, what might a more sustainable version look like? The most interesting recent development in the space is KSI's involvement with Dagenham and Redbridge. KSI has over 24 million YouTube subscribers across his main channels. Put that alongside Hashtag's 673,000 and you understand the difference in commercial leverage. But what makes the Dagenham partnership interesting is that KSI is not trying to build a new club from scratch. Dagenham bring what Hashtag United have always lacked: a football league history, an established local fan base, existing infrastructure, and genuine community roots. KSI brings reach, brand value, and access to an audience that would never otherwise engage with Dagenham and Redbridge. Each brings what the other cannot easily acquire. That is a more coherent proposition than asking a content-first club to function in a pyramid designed for community institutions. Whether it works in practice remains to be seen, but as a model for how digital influence and traditional football might coexist, it offers something very interesting. Hashtag's own version of this, stepping back to step 4, investing in their new ground at Redbridge, building a physical community around an already established online one, may prove to be the same logic applied from a different starting point. The goal, as Owen describes it, is to find the level where the two models reinforce each other rather than pulling apart. The conclusion. English football has spent decades building a system that rewards overreach and punishes caution. Spend beyond your means, find an owner willing to subsidise the gap, chase the next division. Most clubs do it, many suffer for it, and some do not survive it. Hashtag United have looked at that system, understood what it would cost them, not just financially, but commercially in terms of their content model that makes them viable, and chosen a different path. Whether that decision ultimately works is something we will not know for a couple of years. The new ground, the rebuilt attendance base, the attempt to make the online community and the physical club reinforce each other, all of that remains to be proven. But there is something genuinely interesting in what they represent. They're a club with no traditional roots, no wealthy backer, and no geographical community in the conventional sense. But nevertheless, they've built something real, a fan base that cares, a women's team that wins trophies, and a commercial model that operates well. And when it came to a difficult decision, they handled it with more consideration for the people involved than many clubs far higher up the football pyramid have managed. Yes, the YouTube model has real constraints. The pyramid has structural problems that digital reach cannot solve. But the idea that football clubs can be built around online communities and that those communities can be as genuine and loyal as any built around a postcode, that idea is not going away. What comes next for Hashtag will be worth watching. And if it works, it may point towards something more broadly important about what sustainable football ownership actually looks like. If you found this useful, do subscribe, and I'd be genuinely interested in your thoughts in the comments section whether this kind of model represents a viable future for digital first clubs or whether the constraints are simply too significant to overcome. Until next time, see you then.